So I'm Stef Penner. I am Stef on IRC and Stefan Penner everywhere else. I'm an addict. I like open source a lot. Most of this is in my free time, but lately I've had more time during work to do this. I was a little bit worried, but this dude is a machine. So I'm just a hobbyist. No actual problems here. Anyways, so I'm also a husband with an incredibly patient wife who gives me a lot of evenings and weekends to work on open source. We're also crazy bird people. They occasionally help pair with me when I'm working on some hard problems. Anyways, so it turns out I'm also on the Ember core team, and that's where a lot of my open source contributions go. This is a cool random image. I love throwing nice imagery into my talks, mainly because they look cool and not enough talks have cool images. Anyways, I also work for Yap Labs. We do Ember.js consulting and training in New York City. Anyways, so what if I told you that reading a PowerPoint aloud isn't the same as teaching? Wait, I just did that. So I love discussion. I like when people talk to me during my talks. I like to communicate back to them. So if you have something to say, speak out, but be mindful. I'm sure we all want to break for lunch. I'll cut you off if it's too long, but please, if you have questions or thoughts or concerns, I would much rather have a dialogue than go through a slide deck. Anyways, so a little bit about me. I actually started programming a long time ago. My mother was a music teacher, and I went to elementary school at the same school she went to. So that basically meant I had 2 hours of detention all of elementary school, and I could do my homework or I could play on the computers. So that quickly turned into me fixing computers, me doing the website, me writing JavaScript, and I think the only thing I wrote in JavaScript was like a few mouse overs, and then the thing that followed your mouse everywhere. And I thought, it'd be really cool someday to learn a real programming language and like get a real job programming. But it turns out I didn't actually grow up, and I program JavaScript all the time. Anyways, so this talk is about Ember. It's about the conventions that make using Ember make you more productive, make you happier. And for those that don't know, Ember is a framework specifically for creating ambitious applications. But as it turns out, there's a little bit of a misconception. It actually works for really small applications too. It's just that almost immediately your application grows, you want tools to manage that complexity. So just a little demo here I'm going to throw up. To show you what the minimal Ember application would look like. All right, maybe Firefox doesn't want to open up for me. Come on, open source browser, please. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so can you guys see that all right up here? So this is basically the minimal Ember app that you have to create. Instead of ng app, for Angular folks, you have to Ember application create. Instead of just writing normal templates in HTML, you put them in a script tag. The reason for this is the same reason why ng users use something called ng cloak, and that is DOM in the, DOM isn't inert. So if it renders, then your JavaScript loads, then you hide the DOM. Anyway, so in order for us to render templates that are inert, we occasionally will use script tags for this. HTML5 has an awesome new attribute called a template tag, which both Ember and Angular will utilize once we can actually use this cross-browser. Anyway, so this is the smallest, shortest little Ember app you can write, but it's not really dynamic, doesn't do anything cool. So let's do a little bit of data binding here. And another misconception is that Ember requires Ember objects. They're mostly around just for convenience, but as it turns out, you don't actually need them. My name is Stef. Save this, jump back to Firefox, refresh the page. Stef, fantastic. But Stef, wait, there's no data binding happening, right? Well, actually, as it turns out, you can data bind to simple POJOs in Ember as well. Again, typically you just don't do this because you end up wanting other things in the object hierarchy, and Ember provides an object model for you, so you end up just using the object model all the time. So let's do a quick data binding thing here. As you can see, Ember is using these handlebar curlies for any place that's dynamic in the DOM. So for example, this curly curly represents the eventual or potential value of user.name. And this is just an input tag helper. That is just an input, except it has binding functionality. And we're saying, hey, again, you also bind yourself to user.name. So let's jump back to Firefox here. Great. And look, we're doing data binding with a POJO. Interesting. Anyways. Pardon me? If I take... Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure what you... It needs to be pinned somewhere, but typically in Ember apps, it's always pinned on the context, which is very similar to the scope in Angular, if that makes sense. If I remove the line and went back, this one here? Yeah, yeah, okay. But thank you for the question. Yeah, so there's various helpers and stuff that you can use, and they're all easier to use once you have the object model, because you can just use helpers on the object model to accomplish these things. Anyways, that was just a small aside. I just want to show that there's different ways of playing with Angular, with Ember. But it does, we definitely focus a lot on what happens when your application grows to 2, 3, 4, 20, 50 developers. That's absolutely a place where we invest a huge amount of time. But in case you want to play with something small, absolutely, it works for you as well. Anyways, back on track here. So Ember is fancy, it's neat. There's lots of sometimes hype about it. For example, some features that are still not out, but they will be out soon, apparently. Actually, on the note of HTML bars, which is our new templating layer, it is very close. We are actually able to drop this into a few of our client apps, and it's working great. We're just working on some browser compatibility fun. And a big thing for Ember is just cross 1x compatibility. So when we provide people this new template layer, it should actually just be a drop-in with 0 bugs. So this is why it's taking us a little bit longer. Anyway, so some motivations around Ember. Abstractions can save time. Abstractions often hide complexity. Abstractions guide learning and collaboration. So if everyone is working at the same abstraction level, they can have a conversation at that same abstraction level. They don't have to get distracted by some low-level details. Because of this, abstractions can enable cost sharing. Unfortunately, abstractions are often hard to get correct. That's the worst type of abstraction is a leaky abstraction. But it turns out we're all JavaScript developers. We are so many miles from actual metal. We know nothing but abstractions. Another thing abstractions bring us is a common language. So if we can talk in the domain of the problem to a fellow coworker, we're much likely to have less confusion, more productivity. And when I talk to Trek, for example, I say, Trek, please update the router DSL to something specific in the router, he will know that it's constrained to that particular problem and not entirely unbounded. So this is a useful thing. And Ember tries to really focus on what would be the right language for the current problem solving at hand. Is that your template layer? Is that your object layer? Is that your dependency injection layer? Wherever it is, Ember tries to figure out what that language would be, so you can have a good conversation about it with your coworkers without getting confused. So why is this important? Well, software is software. Humans are humans. Does anyone know what this is? It's a high-pass filter. And anyone know what a high-pass filter does? Confuse the developers. So a high-pass filter is an electronic filter that passes high-frequency signals, but attenuates, reduces the amplitude of signals with frequencies lower than a specific cutoff frequency. So why would I bring this up? We're programming, we're not building circuits. Here's another example of what a high-pass filter can accomplish. High fidelity, very limited fidelity. Unfortunately, it turns out we humans are high-pass filters. If you describe a problem to me, I'm probably going to think that I understand it, but in reality, I don't. This is a great success of humans, because we can actually work in systems that we have no idea how they work. This is how chemistry works and physics works and all these things. We can have an approximation, and our approximation might be entirely wrong. But as it turns out, we can still be successful with this. Unfortunately, this is also the reason why we have lots of problems. When two people converse, they think they both agree on the same topic, but it turns out they have entirely different perspectives. It's just part of human nature. If I look around this room, my brain tells me, yes, you have seen everything in this room. But there's actually like an infinite number of things in this room, and my brain really hasn't processed it. It just basically tricked me into thinking that I have. So this turns out to be a pretty big productivity sinkhole. As soon as we sort of like have to focus in on the minutia, new problems become available to us. We realize that our assumptions from a week ago are now entirely wrong. And this is a big cost in software. How often have you guys done some requirements gathering and realized that at the end of the project, those requirements were absolutely dead on? Have you? No? You? Yeah, you. Anyone here? Right? There's no way to actually do that. So you start a new project. You crack open the new project. Everything is wonderful. Everything is wonderful. Greenfield euphoria, with the technical term for this is the honeymoon phase. You haven't made any choices yet, so you haven't screwed it up yet. So basically, you start off, and then all of a sudden your app turns into, you know, I really want to start a new greenfield application. We have made some poor choices early on, and it'd be really nice if we could start again. But that's a big cost waste, absolutely. And how do we end up at this place? Who here has an application that they've worked on for multiple years that's just as wonderful as the day they cracked open that new framework? Anyone? No, it's just never actually going to happen. But why? Well, like I said before, the choices you make are just a liability. Any choice you make, you have the chance of making the wrong choice because you have the wrong information. Because of this, the code you write is just an absolute liability. But risk aversion is also very poor because you'll basically get nothing done ever. If you sit down and you're like, all right, well, what can possibly go wrong? You will run into a scenario where you're stuck in analysis paralysis. And this happens to absolutely everyone here, but there's some fun tricks in order to get yourself out of analysis paralysis. And that is basically reduce the scope of the problem. Share that burden with many people and reduce the scope of the problem. So you can focus on specific things. Now, I know this is a JavaScript conference, but this is an excellent book even for non-JavaScript programmers. Confident Ruby. Basically, by reducing the unknowns in your systems and instead writing very confident code, you know for a fact this function will only be called with 2 values. You can reduce a lot of defensive programming. You can reduce a lot of misconceptions. And again, you've then made less choices, less potential screw-ups. So let's go and kill some distractions. And this is somewhere where Ember really shines. We try to give you the right tools for the right job in the right places. So if we look at software development, distractions are often the most brittle places, the most error-prone places, pointless code, and misaligned primitives. Misaligned primitives would be like in JavaScript or in the DOM, you have an input tag. It's quite useful. A dialog tag, is that useful? Some people say yes, some people say no. Wrong primitives can lead to basically building a pyramid that will collapse onto itself. Anyways, so another place where brittle code exists is when you're writing glue code. I would like this controller and that controller to communicate with one another. I would like this router and that template to communicate with one another. I would like this to happen after this Ajax has occurred so I can populate the data correctly. And with Angular, you have a wonderful dependency injection framework to help sort out these runtime bootstrapping problems with your objects. Turns out Ember has a dependency injection framework as well. Why is bootstrapping your own code or writing this glue code bad? Well, it's often implemented pretty terribly. Makes testing very hard. Refactoring hard, adding new features hard. It's different every time. This means that if Ray is working on a project and I jump on his project, I'm like, so how did you bootstrap this? Well, he's actually gonna have to tell me this. I wonder if there's a convention we could use to know for a fact that controllers are always instantiated with this collaborator. Also, a place where you can specifically specify these edge cases or these custom bootstrapping pieces of code. And again, that same problem makes onboarding hard. If every project is entirely different, every time you look at a project, it's a new learning curve. So you're at a company that has 6 apps. You move between teams. It's like, sure, they're using the same framework, but it's an entirely different world at every stage. It just costs a lot of time and energy. So another place that you waste a heck of a lot of time, and that's support tooling. So this is tooling that has basically nothing to do with the finished product, but you need it in order to develop. So in client-side MVC apps, these are the types of support tooling I'm talking about. You have to fingerprint, you have to minify, lint, deploy, some sort of stubs potentially while you're developing, testing in multiple browsers, getting CI set up, version control set up, post-processor, pre-processors, macros, package management, deploying to Cordova or Node WebKit, and then this all has to be cross-platform because your teams use Linux, Mac, and Windows. Who actually wants to do this every time they start a project? No, probably not. I know that I definitely don't like doing this. I would like to just basically start a project and I'm off running, and then I want to be able to basically deploy by the end of the day and feel like I've accomplished something. I don't want to spend a week building build tooling or a month and doing it poorly. So if you undertake this, it's going to need to be good. It's going to need to be fast and extensible, or you're just going to slow yourself and your fellow developers down. And by the way, actually, this has nothing to do with the feature set you're trying to deliver. So make sure that's done too by Tuesday. Another common problem in client-side apps is just navigation. So it turns out that if you're doing server-side rendered HTML, you get the back button for free, you get navigation for free, you get history and bookmarking for free because it's basically built into the browser. As soon as you jump into the Angular, the Backbone, the Knockout, the Ember world, all of a sudden navigation becomes somewhat of a potentially difficult problem. Has anyone here sort of hand-tuned push state, pop state, history location stuff to make an application work well? How did you enjoy your time? No, that's fine. That's fine. For some people, it's not an issue. For other projects, it can get pretty gnarly, especially if you have some asynchrony in there. Back button needs to work, all this fun stuff. And it turns out, what if you just didn't have to maintain it and write it yourself? So rather than you spending any time on it, what if it was just because you went down the happy path, you got it pro bono? This back button costs me a lot of time in the past. Clients like, well, I hit the back button and I jump back out to the landing page. What is this, right? Now you have to go through and meticulously build up a history. And some browsers don't have HTML5 history support. And it gets a big pain in the butt. So what if I were to tell you that you could get this for free just by abiding by a few conventions? So the rest of the talk is going to be like problem solution style. So I'm going to present the problem, kind of talk about how Ember solves it. I'm not going to go into too much detail for all of these. This is more a quick high-level idea of how Ember likes to tackle problems. So the first one, very simple here. There's a problem, asynchrony, Ajax requests, push notifications, coordination between various iframes. This is all asynchronous. As it turns out, coordinating asynchrony can be tricky. Propagating errors with asynchrony, basically if you have to propagate errors yourself, you're just not going to write code that does error handling. Luckily, there's a solution that covers most of these fairly well, and that's just in the place of using one-time asynchronous functions, use a promise instead. You get the error handling code for free, and you get wonderful primitives to aggregate or do operations in sequence. So this is the non-promise world. Anyone want to tell me what this does? Trek, you look like you want to tell me. No? I don't even know what it does. And not only do I not know what it did, and I wrote this yesterday, it probably has bugs in it. And the next person to fix a bug in there is probably going to introduce another bug. So callbacks, they kind of fall into this world of they make the problem worse, especially as you start to compose them. Luckily, promises, exact same function, accomplishes this. This is readable. Sure, you have to understand just a little bit more. You have to understand how promises work, but it turns out that's something you can learn. And once you know it and your team knows it, you can use that as a communication mechanism when you're that common language. You can look at this, you can read it, you can understand this. Unfortunately, I just realized I wrote fail instead of catch. Fail is not part of the promise spec. So in your mind, just do a sed and replace fail with catch, and we'll be good to go. In Ember, great, we have a fully compliant ES6 promise we have a promise implementation that's fully ES6 compliant, and not only is it fully ES6 compliant, it was actually part of the decision-making process for the standard when they decided what promises should look like and should feel like. Dominic Denicola did most of the work for the promise specification with a lot of help. And one of the reference implementations was, in fact, RSCP, which is the implementation that we use. The only thing that we do, in addition to what the promise specification does, is finally. And basically, finally was an omission because they're going to add it in ES7. Turns out that when you have to do cleanup, regardless if there's a success or failure, finally is incredibly important. All right, so next problem, coupling. Your controller, your model, your view, they all need references to each other in some way. But doing this in an ad hoc basis is a error-prone glue code that if you write, it's a liability to you. And Ember solves this in a very similar way to Angular, where we have a dependency injection framework. We split this into two specific concepts. We have a container, and the container basically abstracts away the coupling between the entities, so it abstracts away the relationships. For example, if the baseball needs a reference to the bat, this knowledge would live in the container, and there's a specific DSL for specifying this linkage between these points. The other part that Ember uses is the resolver, and that is it abstracts away how to find code. This means that the container shouldn't actually know where your code is. Is it a global? Is it in a module? Doesn't matter. So with these two pieces of abstraction, we have an inversion of control system in our Ember apps. So although there is an inversion of control system, the vast majority of Ember code that I write really never touches it. But it turns out that internally, every single object that's instantiated and maintained is just done by the framework for us. And the reason for this is Ember has a lot of high-level APIs that, again, they're there to facilitate a good common language to solve the 80% solution. But as soon as you need those last 20%, you can basically peel away the covers and have a really high-fidelity, maximally flexible API. This is an overarching API design choice for Ember. Any place where you see something that's wonderful and will definitely only do the 80% for you, you peel it away and you have absolutely every tool you need under the hood. Again, the reason is the less code that you write, the less poor choices you make, the happier you're going to be, the happier your coworkers are going to be with you, the easier tests are going to be, the easier it is to upgrade Ember. But ultimately, every application has those snowflake aspects where they have to rip away this nice veneer and jump in. So here's just a quick example of what this low level would look like. That's actually fairly uncommon in most Ember apps, but occasionally you whip it out. Basically, there's a concept of initializers. They run before applications start. And at this point in time, we basically tell the dependency injection framework, for every route, please give them a property, and that property should be a tweet service. Oh, and for every controller that's called social, let's also give them the tweet service. Now, at any point in time when the system decides that, or you decide you need a new route or a new controller called social, it will automatically get a tweet service injected upon it. I don't know why I put this in here. This image I keep pulling from deck to deck to deck, and I don't know why. I think this is from a promise talk where I was talking about a simulation, a promise simulation, and just kind of stuck. Okay, so a big problem in Ember actually is traditionally Ember apps were written in a global form. So this meant you had a global namespace, app.controller, app.postModel, app.view, and now this got us a long way, and traditionally JavaScript applications were written like this. But it turns out it was a big mistake, basically. Why? More coupling order independent load. We've had some clients who, super big applications, actually started alphabetizing their collaborators to make sure they were required in the right order. So they would have like A controller and Z controller, only so that they would be ordered correctly with their .NET build tool system. So it was a very quick and easy sell to them to say, hey, let's switch your entire code base over to use a module system, either an AMD, CJS, or ES6 modules. So ES6 modules are the module system that will be shipping in browsers shortly. And it's basically a very specific disjoint set of CJS and AMD, but specifically to act more like script tags do in the browser than synchronous modules do in the node world, if you guys are familiar with it. This is kind of the syntax. Import Ajax from Ajax. Oh, but I also want to import get off Ajax. And on the other side here, this is the export side, ajax.js. So there's this concept of a default. It's like the primary thing you're exporting. And then there's also like different properties you can export. So your Ajax utility can provide just a default Ajax that gives you all the fancy stuff, but it can also provide you get, post, put, delete, all these other fun things. So these are ES6 modules, and lots of Ember apps that are being developed now are actually being written in ES6. You might ask how this is possible. Via our build system, we can use a transpiler to transpile ES6 to something that works in IE6 and higher. And if you actually combine these two things, a module system and the inversion of control system, your app actually can assemble itself. Basically, zero bootstrapping code needs to be written, because by conventions and because of the dependency injection framework and the service lake locator stuff, as collaborators get accessed, their collaborators are created and instantiated, and all of a sudden, all this code that we had to maintain before, all this liability, is just gone. We can just, once again, we can just focus entirely on our the domain we're trying to solve, the startup we're trying to start to IPO. Another thing is, turns out with a single page applications, your code base will have many entry points. This isn't just a single page. They click a link, refresh whole new state of the world. Every possible place a user can navigate to inside of a single page app is another entry point to your application. And when you're writing manual bootstrapping code to make sure these objects are loaded in the right order, it turns out this becomes incredibly hard, because sometimes the user might go straight to the comment in the comment thread. Other times he'll go straight to the comment thread, then to the comment. And doing this bootstrapping code and dealing with asynchrony when you're loading stuff is just a problem you don't actually want to solve. So instead, hey, let's just defer it, and the dependency injection framework can handle this for us. When I realized this, I was like, oh man, all this code I wrote, it's gone, and there's no, I don't have to write anything here. This is wonderful. So another problem is just routing in general. Again, URLs, keeping URLs in sync, but routing has another interesting thing. So what happens when you go to /users and it's server-side rendered? Well, you go to /users, you send a request, the server does the required backend SQL calls, builds up a collection, and then finally when it's complete, or maybe it streams this to you, it will send to you a page that's ready to go. There's basically no asynchrony that you have to manage. Instead, this is something the browser manages for you. But in a single page application, when a user clicks, they want feedback immediately. At that point in time, though, you might have to fetch an unknown number of different asynchronous operations in order to compose the data you need for that page. And at this point, the URL and the routes become theoretically very complicated, because they have to handle the loading case, the error case, and also your link tags. You're going to want them to have active classes, or loading classes, or disabled classes. And again, turns out that in Ember, the routes, and template level helpers just make that problem go away entirely. By following the happy path, you get those loading classes, you get those active classes, and you can, once again, focus on the product you're trying to build rather than these nice little niceties. So first of all, this is kind of what the Ember's router looks like. It's a DSL specifically for basically displaying the hierarchy of resources and routes in your application. As you can see, there's a foo nested inside of admin, so you'd have like admin/foo, two top-level routes, bar and car, but oh, by the way, you want to rename car to vehicle, but your internal domain model is still car. Rather than going and updating all of your anchor tags to follow this new naming convention that your business has decided, just by specifying it in the router, the rest of the system knows that this is the new URL for the specific thing. This is a route. It's a very simple route. It's probably the simplest route you can make that does a little bit of asynchrony. So the one most important hook, as you can see, I'm subclassing from an Ember object here. I'm subclassing from Ember route, and Ember route has one incredibly important method, and that is the model method. When I navigate to /car/1, this model method, or in this case, if I navigate to /user, this model method will be invoked. I'll be able to grab any parameters that were passed in. At that point in time, I'll fetch an Ajax request. This is a simple Ajax helper that returns a promise that will eventually fulfill to the payload, or it will reject with the reason of the failure. During this time, Ember's router actually goes into a loading phase where it can render a loading template for you, right in the right place. Also, the link you clicked on at that point in time also goes into loading, and the one you left is no longer active, and the new one then becomes active once, in fact, this has finished. Again, all for free, all because of conventions. And this function consumes any type of promise, so you can just throw a $Ajax in there, and it will work. If you, in fact, need to compose multiple Ajax requests to get the data you need, it will work just fine. And here's that thing I was talking about. That turns out to be awfully tricky to write on your own and to maintain on your own, but instead of just doing ahref, we have a quick helper called link2 that is absolutely identical to ahref, except that it keeps your classes in sync, keeps the href correct based on whatever your router has specified for the path, and then it's a little block form, you can specify the word there. All these things work together, and interestingly, all the dependency injection stuff from before and the resolver stuff from before also works with this. So here's another problem. Assembling source. Now we're using ES6 modules, we want JS hinting, we want minification, we want tests, we want to be able to write our tests in isolation, we want multiple different types of builds. Turns out the solution to this is build tooling. Build tooling is a pain. There's a lot of good solutions out there. Yeoman, Brunch, a whole bunch of different solutions. We wanted to really understand what this problem was for an Ember app. We have all these conventions. Is there some way that we can get more bang for our buck out of a build system that truly embraces these conventions rather than not? So what we did is, in traditional, or how we solve all of our problems, is we look for roads that have been basically created because many people have been walking over this cow path. Looks like there's something there, but it's definitely not efficient, might smell, people get lost along the way, applications fail, crash, bugs happen. We look at something like this and we want a path to the Autobahn, basically. So what we try to do is we try to pave these cow paths on a regular basis. So specifically for build tooling, again, not every Ember app is built with these specific build tools. Lots are rolled by themselves. We started off with a project called Ember App Kit, and it existed purely to basically scenario solve every problem, so we could understand what we could optimize away so that developers' lives could be easier, teams could be more productive. And so it was all right, it was pretty successful. It was started in June 30th, 2013, had about 512 commits, 71 contributors, 519 issues closed. The problem was it was this grunt-based build system, and grunt works, I think, well as a primary abstraction, but building on grunt as like a underlying abstraction gets kind of messy. Also, when we'd fix problems, it would be very hard for people to upgrade because basically the entire API surface area was POJOs in their grunt configuration, and this was just a massive pain in the butt. Solution, basically just better abstractions. What are abstractions we can test against? Can we reduce the API so there's less to know, less to screw up on, more for us to test? And there were lots of bugs. especially when you're manually building this build pipeline. Someone would fix one bug here, and they would introduce another bug here, and it was just a big pain, and it was really hard to actually thoroughly test a grunt-based build system. And who here has a build system that they've hand-rolled that they've also tested? Nobody. No one would do this because they need to ship their product by Tuesday. They don't have time to write tests for their build tool system or their specific configuration of that build tool system. Build stability. When looking at Gulp and Brunch and a few other of these build pipelines, so I use Git and I switch between branches very often. And this would, under all circumstances, screw up the build pipeline. I would basically have to restart my build pipeline, or even worse, I would delete a file or move it, and it wouldn't realize that. And I would continue to work for 30 minutes, only to realize later that, actually, Steph, your build isn't working. Your app doesn't think you've deleted that previous file, and you're sitting there. And you basically burnt 30, 40 minutes of your time thinking everything is working because some of your files are reloading, but not all of them. This was just a massive pain in the butt. So one of our community members actually tried to rethink this problem a little bit. And rather than being both a command line tool and a build pipeline and a task runner and a package management system, she designed it to be specifically a build pipeline. A build pipeline that had a nice DSL that made you feel like you're operating on trees, applying filters to trees, merging trees, collapsing trees, and spitting out output at the end, while still maintaining 100% accuracy with what exactly was on the file system disk. Anyway, so the solution to this problem is basically use a specific build tool, like, in this case, Broccoli. Anyway, so all of these things put together, we ended up creating something called Ember CLI. And right now, we have about 1,600 commits, 110 contributors, 754 closed issues, and according to our analytics, there are actually thousands of people using it, which is pretty cool, considering it's still a 0.0.40 release, which maybe I should version bump. Anyways, so if you guys want to try Ember today, and you have something you want to build that's beyond the starter kit. So the starter kit, if you go to Ember.js.com, you can download a starter kit. It's an index file, very similar to that minimum app I just showed you. Doesn't do any compilation for you, doesn't do any minification. It really is in production ready. If in fact you want to grab a build tool today and be able to build a production build of that within a minute of you downloading this and starting, grab Ember CLI. Once you got it, I'm not going to try to run npm install on a conference Wi-Fi. Once you got it, type Ember new app name, and you basically have a harness for an ambitious application. This isn't just a small island of richness style application. This is one that controls the whole page, has good test running, has compilation, has all these fun things. Anyway, so I'll do a quick example of some of the power we get out of this. Any questions so far? You guys are awfully quiet. I'm gonna have to start picking on you. No questions? No one has any questions about Ember? You're saving it? Okay, okay. Anybody else? No? Relationship advice? I can't give out any of that, so it's a bad idea. Yeah, so the question was, does Ember have any hard dependencies? So it has two hard dependencies. It has handlebars. Runtime is a dependency. It doesn't need the compiler, it just needs the runtime, because typically with Ember CLI, you compile locally, and then you basically get optimized templates that just have to quickly execute in the browser. And it has jQuery as a dependency right now. We're planning on removing, or basically, we're planning on reducing the requirement of jQuery, because our new templating layer basically doesn't use jQuery at all. We're doing just direct DOM manipulation and DOM tree node cloning. So this is incredibly fast for us to do rather than string-based templating. So our templating layer all of a sudden doesn't need jQuery anymore. So we're likely going to release a version that doesn't depend on it, but very quickly you're going to run into problems such as event dispatching, event bubbling, and cross-browser is a pain in the butt. Other things are just normalized nicely by jQuery, so we're likely going to keep including it as the happy path build. where you don't have to deal with various quirks. But it turns out if your browser is like one specific mobile browser and you know all the quirks there, the goal is to allow you to drop jQuery in that place. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so in theory, you can write your templating layer in whatever you want in Ember, except that we have tight integration with handlebars, where we have created a whole bunch of helpers that work with our observation and binding system correctly. And if, in fact, you wander off and do your own thing, you'd have to implement that yourself. Sorry, the question was, why is handlebars a hard dependency for Ember? Does that answer your question? Any other questions? I'm going to milk some. Yeah, so the question was, Steph, you had earlier shown us ES6 module syntax. How do you use that in today's browser? And yes, absolutely. So Ember App Kit and now Ember CLI, they do the transpilation step for us. And currently what we do is we actually build the ES6 syntax into just AMD output. And we use a synchronous AMD loader to wire everything up at runtime together. Answer your question? Yep. Anybody else? Nope. Okay. I'm going to quickly jump into a demo here. So I missed a good slide. So although we have a build tool, and I've spent a lot of time on build tooling, I really would love to live in a world where all of these things just work natively in the browser, and you wouldn't actually need to do transpilation steps. I also am hopeful for a few efforts that the standards bodies are working on right now and browser implementers are working on where you don't actually need to minify your JavaScript anymore. Minification is basically a hack. It'd be really nice if your web server could just, your browser could say, this is the bundle I need, and the web server basically does the work for you and sends something over via HTTP 2.0, so it doesn't incur the high cost for each file that you send. So I'm still hopeful that there will be a future where all this work will basically be irrelevant because we're just going to be able to use sort of native browser stack. But unfortunately, Ember supports currently IE6+, and there's no way that we're ever getting ES6 features into IE6. That is not going to happen. The IE team has, in fact, committed a lot of resources for ES6 and ES7 compatibility. So IE11 and IE12 will contain more and more of the specification, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, we ship the real products on real browsers today. We need a compatibility layer. So until this magical future happens, we'll just need to incur the cost of build tooling. But I'm still hopeful. So now taking all of that information that we've just gotten, we can basically build an app that's production ready in a few lines of code and a few very specific content additions. So basically using Ember CLI after doing the npm install -g Ember CLI, we can do Ember new my new startup, because everyone wants a startup that they can IPO out of and live on a beach for the rest of their life. Step into that startup, step into that project. We're going to quickly generate 2 routes, add some content, run the test suite, because by the way, you get a test suite that runs right away, both in Phantom and all the browsers you have available on your system. You can even connect your mobile phone, immediately have tests running there. Again, your cost to you was npm install -g Ember, and all of a sudden you have this whole build harness that does something for you. And once you're ready to, in fact, deploy this, Ember build env production, you'll automatically get minification. We'll also go over all your ES6 syntax, turn it into stuff that works in not just ES5 browsers, but ES3 browsers. So for example, on promises, they have this catch keyword, promise.catch, which is the failure scenario. Turns out IE8 and lower don't support catch. So all those people who are writing catch everywhere, they're actually breaking all their IE users. We quickly detect that, do an AST transform, and turn it into a computed, just the string literal form. We also minify and fingerprint your assets for you. So all of a sudden, boom, you're done. So I'm going to quickly go through this. I won't do the generation step because it does require an internet connection, and I never trust Wi-Fi, so you guys are just going to have to believe me that the Ember new phase works correctly. Or even better, you could try it yourselves. Okay, so here I have an application that was generated for me. And again, this is definitely not that small little application that's as one tiny widget in the corner of your page. This is for a more full-fledged application. It spits out a directory structure. Again, a common place for people to put stuff that is similar. Let me start it up here. And so it started up. It's serving on port 4200. I have some debugging information that popped out. And there we go. We have an Ember app that's here. But that's not that cool, so we should do a little bit more here. First of all, welcome to Ember.js. Not a great way to get on TechCrunch. Oh yeah, we have live reload, so when you make your update, it's good here. It's something that I thought wasn't that highly valuable, but I do a lot of mobile work, and not having to hit refresh on my iPad, my iPhone, and my Android device is actually really nice. So I like it now. Anyway, so my new startup. And my new startup is going to have 2 sections. I want my new startup. What am I doing here? Live coding is terrible. What should my startup be? What are we doing here? Maybe an eBay competitor that hasn't been a good competitor in that space in a while. So we'll do products and carts. So we do this, and as a web developer, I have made a syntax error. I have another syntax error. I can tell by down here my build was crashing, but it recovered. Very important thing for me was if my build has a syntax error or something, I never ever want my build tools to actually crash. I just want them to keep going. And white screen, crap. Lots of people have this problem with Ember, but we have really great error messages. And if you look down here, it actually says, hey, by the way, you don't actually have a route for product. You can't link to it. You have no route. You can't link to it. So if I just had an anchor tag here with a link, it wouldn't actually tell me that I don't have that page. You have a dead link. Turns out Ember will just error at you and tell you very clearly it is time for you to add a new route there. All right, let me get back to this place. And I'm just getting started with Ember. I'm not quite sure what the syntax is, so I'm just actually going to say, use the generators to just generate me a new route. So as we can see here, it actually created 3 files for me. Again, it's conventions. Generated a route file, generated a template, and generated a placeholder for me to write tests for my route. It actually did a third thing, which we don't list yet. I don't know why. But it actually added an entry to the router. So it immediately added the fact that there is a route here. Now if we break out of this debugger, let it refresh, we're going to get another error. And the next error is cart. Okay, silly Steph. All right, great. Now we have cart, navigation, fantastic. But I can't really prove to you that this is navigating. Sure, the URL is updating, but it'd be really great if, in fact, we had some content on these pages. But remember, we generated the route. The routes obviously need something to render, so we quickly threw into blank templates for you. I am cart. I am product. Now quickly navigating here, we can jump between cart and product. Smaller. All right, that's kind of handy. Who here's worked on a UI project where the back end wasn't ready yet for you? What do you guys do? You just put a JSON thing in your file and you just load it synchronously. So I've done this too, but something that I run into very quickly is the world is asynchronous with latency. So I, as a developer, like everything's fast and wonderful, and there's no race conditions, but I have just lied to myself. And since this is such a common thing, and I love to prep, and I love to spike things out before there's a backend, we actually just provide API stubs that we can quickly generate. Let's make an API stub for cart. And sorry, the screen is so, what have I done here? Oh, new, it's supposed to be generate. Why didn't you guys catch this? You guys are terrible pair programmers. And G is the short for generate. So if I look, it has generated a new server for us and has generated a cart. And super raw, nothing fancy. It's just a quick express server that you can drop in a payload for your UI to render. And again, now you have not just real latency, but you can see this in the network tab. You can verify that it's working with across the network, not just locally. Let's add a few entries in here. Name, foo, price, 5. Yeah, 1 is probably fine. Unfortunately, the thing that aggravates me still is I do in fact need to restart the server in order to get API stubs to work after I've done it. Maybe Trek will have some time to make that more awesome. Okay, great. But Steph, we still aren't actually showing foo and price 5 in my cart. Come on, what's going on here? Earlier, I discussed one very important feature of Ember, and that is the model hook inside the router. So basically, if I make a function here and return absolutely anything, it can be just a POJO, it can be an Ember object, it can be an Ajax request that returns a promise. If I put this here, I'm just going to mimic what the API response will look like. It'll look something like this. Name, foo, price, 5. JS hint got angry. We now have a mechanism by which we can pass code to the rest of our system, to the controllers and to the templates. So I'm quickly going to enumerate over this inside of the cart template here. Now, as you can see, we have foo 5. Great. Thanks, Steph. You've loaded synchronous data. You should use your API stubs. You have cool stuff. But again, this hook, it can take any type of value, promise or not promise. Ember CLI ships with just a nice wrapper around jQuery's Ajax that converts jQuery's Ajax into A+ compliant promises. So basically promises that are spec compliant. jQuery's promises are all right. They got them a long way. Unfortunately, they really fall down when it comes to error handling scenario. So we just basically give you a very simple helper that wraps this for you. Now that I have my stub ready, I'm going to replace this with Ajax. So again, here, I just quickly imported Ajax from the library IC Ajax. Go to API, cart. Live coding never goes this well. And it looks like it may work correctly. But let's confirm this. Let's actually just change the route information here to 6. Yeah, that lied to me. Didn't actually detect that correctly. Hopefully soon that will be fixed. Refresh and 6. So we are pulling Ajax down. Our template couldn't care about Ajax. The only thing we have is this model hook that's responsible for asynchrony in Ember applications. And that's pretty neat. But turns out distributed systems, they fail and they have high latency. So what if I wanted to add a loading template, for example? Well, it turns out, again, just by convention, if in fact there's a loading template, Ember will know to place it in the right place where you need it. So if you have a top-level loading template, it'll put it into any little place where it's waiting on asynchrony before it can render it. If you want a more specific loading template, you basically just name it cart/loading, and it will take the place of where carts will be once they're done loading. So I'm going to change this into loading, ... And it flickered very quick there. You guys trust me, or should I jump back and put a set timeout on the server side? You trust me? No, you didn't? Okay, I'll quickly do that. We're getting close to lunch here. I'm almost done. So 5 seconds should be enough for us to see it. Let's restart the server. Oh, it's so aggravating. Hopefully soon we can not have that anymore. Oh, well, there is a thing called loading, which is a little bit wrong. But by convention, we have a loading template in the place where we're waiting for that specific thing. So as a sibling to loading, we have error. And I don't think I need to explain what happens there. Distributed systems fail. Promises also reject. They don't just fulfill. Great, easy place to do error handling. Great place to get basically 500 style pages that you had for server-side rendering or server-side rendered templates. You just get them pro bono in this system. All right. So let's jump back to Keynote here. Oh, shoot. I was supposed to show that. So the live demo actually went pretty good. I only did a few little typos. Anyways, so that's kind of a really quick glance at some things Ember can do for you today. Ember is actually massive. There's a whole bunch of different places where it has very, very specific tooling for you. Don't let that overwhelm you. Focus on the specific things that you want to ship, right? You got a template with a form, great. Focus on that. Don't look at the rest of the stuff. But at some point, your application might grow, the complexity might increase, you might need more. And you might think of Ember as a single monolithic application or a single monolithic library. And yeah, we distribute it like that. But actually, internally, Ember is a whole bunch of separate packages. The reason we ship them together and we test them together is we want to ensure that they're never misaligned. So what's the future for Ember? We want to improve code sharing. So we want to enable the community to share code. So they can share code today, but we still feel like browser package management is very sharded and very unfortunate today. In Ember itself, we want to reduce more edge cases. As you know, as you're learning a new system, systems are defined by their crappy parts. Systems are defined by their edge cases. As we move forward, we want to remove these edge cases so that we're all happy and productive developers. We want to improve composition. So we had an idea, a feature we tried out, made it to stable. It's good. Now people want to dissect that feature and they want to reposition it, move it around. And again, like Ember, what we typically do is we have that 80% nice layered API on top, but we want that maximally flexible API underneath. So once a feature proves itself out, we'll probably build out that maximally flexible API underneath to give people the power, but only when they actually want it. And the most important thing here is we really want to continue to learn. We spend a lot of time looking at what Angular and React and Backbone and Knockout have done and do, and there's a lot of awesome work being done. Angular has a really kick-ass team. There's a lot of smart guys there. And as it turns out, a lot of these framework authors, we actually talk all the time. So some of the guys from React, some of the guys from Backbone, we talk quite a bit. I actually think React's new router is using some of Ember's router code, or one of the micro libraries that Ember is using for its router, because it turns out the code is good. Some of the outward APIs are just different. Why not share the code, share the resources? And ultimately, we're all working incredibly hard to make browsers themselves better so we can all ship better, more debuggable code. And one last thing, all these conventions, they buy us good common language, they buy us productivity, they buy us many cool things, and they enable really awesome tools. So as you saw, Batarang exists for Angular. I have to say our solution to this is pretty awesome. We have the Ember inspector. And I saw Batarang and I was like, yeah, it's pretty cool. I think we can do better because we know a lot more about the Ember applications. We know a lot more information. So actually, if you're ever debugging promises, the easiest way to debug promises is to get the Ember inspector and use RSVP instead. And we actually build a graph of all the promises that occurred in your application. And we'll actually show you, oh look, this promise is pending right now. So we actually log all the promises, build up a graph. We show you the dependency tree of this graph. We let you see the dependence, because often when a promise fails or is pending, you don't know who's causing it, so we let you visually explore what's going on. In addition, you can get a trace for when they tells you when they were enqueued in your source code, so you can quickly jump to where the promise was enqueued. Screen is really small for this. In addition to that, we have a view render tree, so you can quickly see what controller is responsible for that subset of your Ember application. So that middle controller with the cart has a template cart. Its controller is called cart. Its model, that thing I returned from the JSON payload, is right here. And I can actually send that thing to the console so that I can interact with it. There's a little $E on the corner. And boom, I can start interacting with this. And as I add things to cart, for example, push object. Again, cart's just an array, but we've added a method onto it, push object, which is basically the observable version of push. We can push a new name, hi, price 5, and basically in real time, we have a wonderful little thing on here. Again, this tool just exists because of the conventions that we have. In addition to that, if you're using Ember data, which I didn't touch on at all, it's basically a data persistence library that's very relational, works with a lot of scenarios. You can actually explore and edit all your data here. And I was playing with Firebase the other day and used their Ember Fire adapter, and I was trying to edit data on their dashboard, and it kept doing like full page reloads. I realized I can edit data faster in the Ember extension than I can use their built-in editor, which seems bad. We do a couple render performance things, and then ultimately a list of various plugins. Now, if in fact you're an Ember developer and there's some part of this part of this tool that you don't like, good news, because it's actually just an Ember app that runs as a Chrome extension. Not only does it run as a Chrome extension, the Firefox guys use it as an exercise to see if they could get a Chrome extension working nicely in Firefox. It works in Firefox now. And as of last week, our team member that works on Ember Inspector, due to popular request, made it work as a bookmarklet. This hasn't been released yet, but it does work. So this is to support Safari and also some of the Internet Explorer. So all of a sudden, you can start using Ember's Inspector, get all of these awesome features, basically regardless of what browser you're on. And for JSBin people, we can jump between iframes quickly, because that was an important deal. All right. The Ember Inspector apparently has 40,000 users. So although Angular is definitely winning on search criteria, we have a really massive community, and we have a really massive team of super passionate, unpaid volunteers that are crazy enough to do this as a labor of love. So if any one company decides that, hey, we're no longer funding this, turns out nothing changed, because it's not getting funded that much anyways. As a downside, though, Angular does have 20 people working on this full time, which is pretty awesome. I'm jealous of that for sure. Anyways, so again, my name is Steph. I'm on the Ember core team. I love open source. I love the browser. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me now, or feel free to catch me later if you want to grab lunch quickly. So one of the problems is a lot of these frameworks are somewhat misaligned, right? It's kind of apples to oranges often. So what you will likely have to do is look at a subset of that functionality and see what the equivalent is. And sometimes they don't even make sense. So Vue.js had a really cool benchmark, but it showed Ember doing incredibly poorly. But Ember has this concept called coalescing, where if it actually takes a bunch of change events, it will do one update at the end. And the way these benchmarks were running is they weren't actually utilizing this. When you disabled the coalescing, or when you re-enabled the coalescing, because they had like hacked around it to make it go away, Ember took 0 time. So again, this comparison was basically just unfair because Ember just doesn't do any work in that case. So sometimes when you're comparing these frameworks, it's quite tricky. Anyways, so there is a alright resource. It's called To-Do MVC, and it shows basically just a to-do MVC in many different frameworks. There's a rumor that the To-Do MVC people would like to basically make To-Do MVC 2, which would be potentially, the rumors on the street, maybe a GitHub issue tracker. So something that embraces some more complexity than a to-do list. As for that, there's a few good articles. Unfortunately, you'll find a lot of people who are just biased. They use one, they prefer that. Interestingly, Alex Machinier, who's on the Ember core team, has written a fantastic comparison that even the Angular core team thought was a very great comparison. So Alex is incredibly hard on himself, and he's always like, Ember's terrible, everything sucks about us. So when he writes stuff, it's straight from the heart. Alex matching, I can provide you a link later. There's also a few other posts coming out. He's actually giving a talk at the end of the month in New York on comparison of React and Ember, precisely for that same reason. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah. So likely what you'll see is Ember is the most feature complete when it comes to these things, for better or for worse. React is a fantastic high-performant templating layer. Flux is a thing they have on top that is kind of strange compared to React. It's cool, but it's a little bit strange. It'll evolve and become awesome, I'm sure. Angular really is more, as they say on their website, is the framework to build the framework for your application, right? Ember really is the framework to build your application. We feel that we can get a huge amount of mileage out of that 80%, give you the power when you need it. So it's just a reconstruction of the same problem. Angular's dirty checking falls down in some places, and Ember's bookkeeping falls down in some places. So Angular will be often much faster at initial renders because it doesn't have to incur the cost of the bookkeeping, whereas Angulars will fall down as soon as you have a huge amount of data in the browser. And so that becomes very hard to compare. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need another. And the worst thing is, all of these frameworks, they have a whole bunch of smart, enthusiastic people working on them. A comparison that was made a day ago is probably wrong a week from now. But there are some philosophical differences that will likely never change. Yes, if your team knows Angular. No, it's not fanboyish, right? There's so many overlapping things, and the problem domain is so similar, right? You use the talent that you have available to you. And if, in fact, you're starting off a project for the first time, let's see what works better with your team. Different types of developers just prefer different paradigms better. Some people prefer, they have comfort in abstractions. They don't want to be right at the bare metal. They have faith in these things. Something like Ember would likely be better for them. If you have a team that much prefers to get down and dirty, maybe something else is better for them. Or maybe they really prefer the dirty tracking mentality. They like Angular for that fact. Trek. Yeah, so we've talked about this. The thing was, if you're doing server-side rendering and then you want your Angular app to basically scoop up the server-side rendered stuff and turn it into an Ember app, it turns out that you used to do Ember kind of like this, where you'd put script tags everywhere and do your templates, and then we ran away from it, and we basically abandoned all documentation and all niceties about this. So it still is possible, but I think I agree with you that today, with the documentation and the simplicity, I would say Angular would make sense in that case. If that's a big popular thing, maybe we should bring back those guides and those things. Any other questions? You guys are good? Well, thank you for being very patient, and enjoy the rest of the conference.